Elias Hargrove was not a man who startled easily. Years of living alone on the wide stretch of valley land had taught him that most surprises could be explained with a little patience and a calm walk toward the noise. But that April morning, when he stepped out onto his porch with his first cup of coffee, his breath caught in his throat. Across the field, thin wooden stakes were sticking up from the grass, each topped with bright orange plastic. They weren't. There yesterday. The pattern was strange, almost like rows in a garden, except the lines cut across fences and split his pasture in awkward angles. He squinted into the early light. Down by the edge of the road, a white van sat with its doors flung open. A man in a yellow vest was kneeling, tapping at something with a hammer. Two others carried clipboards, their heads bent as they walked from stake to stake, jotting notes. They didn't look toward the house, but they didn't seem in a hurry to leave either. Elias set his coffee down on the railing and walked to the end of the porch. His boots crunched over the gravel as he made his way down toward the first stake. The plastic tape tied around the top flapped lightly in the breeze, making a faint rattling sound. When he reached the nearest one, he saw a number written in black marker on the side. 23. That was odd. He moved to the next stake and saw 24, and then 25. They were numbered, like someone had already decided what went where. A voice called out from across the field. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here!" Elias turned. One of the men with the clipboard was striding toward him, the reflective stripes on his vest catching the sunlight. His tone wasn't sharp, but it wasn't friendly either. "This is my property," Elias said plainly. "What are you doing out here?" The man slowed, hesitated, then smiled in a practiced way. "Just marking the survey lines. We've got clearance to be here. Everything's in order." "Clearance from who?" "From the office downtown," the man said, looking down at his clipboard as if that answered everything. "Plans are already moving ahead. You'll be getting paperwork. In the mail." Elias's jaw tightened. "Nobody asked me. Nobody told me anything." The man gave a small shrug. "I just follow the schedule, sir. You can call the office if you've got questions." Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the road, joining the others. Elias stood there for a long moment, the wind carrying faint sounds of hammering from farther up the field. He had lived on this land all his life. It had been his grandfather's before him and his great-grandfather's before that. The papers proving that were in a lockbox in his study, or at least they had been the last time he checked. He pulled the nearest stake out of the ground. It came up easily, leaving a small hole in the damp soil. For a second, he considered snapping it in half, but instead, he laid it gently on the ground and stepped over it, making his way back toward the house. From his porch, the view had changed. It wasn't the wide, unbroken stretch of green he was used to. Now it was dotted with bright plastic and moving figures. The morning sun cast long shadows from the stakes, and for the first time in years, Elias felt like a stranger on his own land. He sipped the last of his coffee, which had gone cold, and thought about what the man had said. Plans were already moving ahead. That meant someone, somewhere, believed they could put their lines and numbers wherever they pleased, and that no one would stop them. Elias had no intention of letting that be true. The first week after the Yale survey stakes appeared, Elias kept expecting them to disappear. He figured the workers would finish whatever strange measurements they needed and then leave, taking their bright markers with them. But instead, the trucks multiplied. By the second week, the field was alive with the noise of engines, the clatter of lumber, and the high whine of saws. Portable toilets appeared near the road. A row of dumpsters followed. Each morning, before the mist had even lifted off the grass, the workers were already there, unloading tools from trailers and shouting to one another over the noise. From his porch, Elias could track the change almost hour by hour. First, the soil was scraped away by yellow machines with steel teeth. Then came the frames, tall, pale skeletons of houses lined up in perfect order. The smell of fresh-cut wood drifted across the yard, sharp and unfamiliar in this place where he was used to the scent of hay and wet earth. He tried speaking to a few of the workers during those early days. Most of them were polite enough, but said they didn't know anything about who had approved the work. They were just there to build what was on the plans. When Elias asked to see those plans, they shrugged, pointed toward a trailer parked at the edge of the site, and said the main office handled that sort of thing. Elias walked over to the trailer one afternoon. A woman inside sat at a desk stacked with folders. She smiled at him but spoke quickly. "Sir, if you've got a question about the project, you'll need to contact the development office in town. I'm just here to keep things moving on schedule." He thanked her, though his voice was tight. As he stepped back outside, he caught sight of a large sign leaning against the trailer. It was still wrapped in plastic, but he could make out the glossy image underneath, rows of beige houses with neat driveways, a little park in the middle, and a caption in bold letters promising a fresh new start for the valley. By the third week, the pace quickened. The skeleton frames were covered in sheathing. Windows appeared. Roof shingles went up in precise, tidy rows. Trucks loaded with sod rolled in, and patches of green were unrolled like carpets in front of houses that had not yet been finished. At night, Elias could see the glow of temporary work lights across the field. He had lived most of his life in a place where the stars were bright and the dark was complete after sunset. Now, the valley was never truly dark. It wasn't just the sight of the buildings that unsettled him. It was the sound. Even when the workers were gone, the wind carried, the creak of new structures settling in the night air. It was as if the land itself was trying to get used to the weight on top of it. One afternoon, Elias stood at his fence line and counted. 25 houses were already framed. 10 more were in various stages of completion. That made 35. In total, each one set on land he had always thought of as his own. It was then he realized something else. The new houses were positioned in a way that turned their backs toward his property. No front porches faced him. No windows looked in his direction. It was as if the people who planned them wanted to close him out completely, to make the line between his land and theirs as hard as a wall. The next morning, a fresh stack of lumber arrived, followed by a cement truck that rumbled past his gate. Elias didn't wave. He didn't say a word. He just watched, feeling something slow and solid take root inside him. They were building fast, faster than seemed natural, and they clearly had no thought to ask him permission or even offer him an explanation. But speed, Elias knew, could be a weakness. When people built in a hurry, they didn't always stop to consider what might already be there. And up on the hill, behind the line of trees, something very old was still waiting. The road to Pine Hollow Dam was older than most of the houses in the valley, and it showed. Cracks snaked across the faded asphalt, and grass grew through them in tall, thin blades. Few people ever took that road anymore, and even fewer knew where it ended. Elias knew it well. As a boy, he had followed his father up that winding climb more times than he could count. They would carry tools in a canvas bag, the metal clinking softly as they walked. At the top, the dam spread out like a wall of stone against the sky, holding back the broad sheet of water that shimmered in the sunlight. The dam was more than just a landmark. It was the lifeline of the valley. For decades it had fed the irrigation, ditches that kept the farmland green through the long summers. The gates and spillways were heavy with rust now, but the old machinery still worked. Elias knew that for certain. He had kept it that way. The control shack sat off to the side, a squat building of weathered boards with a tin roof that rattled in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of oil and damp wood. An iron wheel stood in the center, its spokes thick and worn smooth from years of use. Gauges lined the far wall, their needles quivering faintly, and a row of levers rested in their slots like silent sentinels. It was quiet there, except for the low hum of water pressing against the gates. The sound had a weight to it, a reminder of the force that waited on the other side. Elias ran his fingers along the spokes of the wheel, remembering the first time his father had let him turn it. He had been no taller than the wheel itself, and it had taken all his strength just to move it an inch. The water that rushed out that day had been a trickle compared to what the dam could truly unleash. For years, he had maintained the gates, with quiet diligence. A little oil on the hinges, a careful turn of the gears each spring, and a watchful eye on the reservoir after the rains. The dam was part of his inheritance, not on paper, but in the unspoken understanding passed down through the family that it was both a gift and a responsibility. From the top of the dam, the view stretched for miles. The new houses stood out in sharp lines against the green valley, their roofs glinting in the sun. The road to them looked like a thread from this distance, winding through fields that had once been open and untouched. Elias leaned on the railing, his eyes following the slope of the land. He knew exactly how the water would travel if the gates were opened all at once. It would rush down the natural gullies, fan out through the low ground, and gather speed. The houses were built right in, its path. That thought wasn't yet a plan, not fully, but it lodged in his mind and stayed there, like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread slowly. He turned away from the railing and stepped back into the shack. The rain had been steady for weeks, and the reservoir was higher than he had seen it in years. The gauges confirmed it. Each needle was pressed to the far edge of the safe zone. Elias closed the door, slid the latch, and stood for a moment in the dim light. The air felt cooler here, heavier somehow. He imagined the gates below, their bolts straining under the constant push of the water. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tin roof. Down in the valley, hammers echoed faintly, the sound carried up the hill. The builders worked without pause, racing to finish before the next rain. Elias stepped outside, locked the shack, and started down the road. He didn't know yet what he would do, but he knew one thing with certainty. The dam was his, and no one had thought to ask what that meant. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, tucked among the usual stack of bills and catalogs. Elias almost missed it at first. It was a plain white envelope with no return address, the kind that looked like it held nothing more than a flyer. But when he turned it over, he saw a seal embossed in gold in the corner. Not an official government one, but polished enough to suggest someone wanted it to look important. He set the rest of the mail on the kitchen table and opened the envelope, with a careful tear. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, folded neatly in thirds. The language was formal, but the message was clear. It stated that the appearance of his barn was inconsistent with the visual harmony of the surrounding area, and that repainting it in a neutral tone was strongly recommended. A polite suggestion, it seemed, until he reached the final paragraph. There, in smaller print, it noted that if he did not make appropriate updates within 30 days, steps could be taken to ensure compliance with local development guidelines. Elias set the letter down slowly. The barn in question had stood for nearly 80 years. Its red paint was faded and chipped in places, but it was sound and dry inside, holding his tools, hay bales, and the few pieces of equipment he still used. It had been his father's before it was his, and his grandfather's before that. He read the letter again, each sentence pressing into him like a thumb against a bruise. The phrasing was careful, no threats outright, but each line pointed in the same direction. Someone had decided that his barn on his land should look the way they preferred. Elias walked out to the barn as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The red boards glowed in the fading light, the wood grain deep and warm. He ran his palm along the rough surface, feeling the grooves where the paint had worn away. The barn smelled faintly of hay and machine oil, the same as it had for decades. He thought about the men with clipboards, the way they had walked through his field as though the ground were already theirs. Now there was a letter telling him to change something that had never been anyone else's concern. The sound of a truck engine pulled him from his thoughts. He looked toward the road and saw a pickup slowing near his gate. A man in a pressed shirt leaned out the driver's window and waved politely. "Evening, Mr. Hargrove," the man called. "Just wanted to let you know the development's almost done. It's really going to raise the value of your area." Elias didn't reply. "Oh, and that letter," the man continued. "It's just a formality. We like everything to match out here. Keeps things looking nice." Still, Elias said nothing. The man gave a quick nod, shifted the truck into gear, and drove on. The sound of the engine faded, leaving the valley quiet. Again. Elias stood there for a long moment, watching dust settle in the road's low spots. He carried the letter back inside, folded it neatly, and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. His hands moved without hurry. But inside, something was different now. It wasn't the barn. Not really. It was the fact that someone he'd never met felt entitled to decide what should stand on his land and how it should look. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the field. The barn was a dark shape against the silver grass. Beyond it, the new houses stood in their neat rows, their pale siding catching the faint light. The letter lay in the drawer, but its words still echoed in his mind. 30 days. Steps to ensure compliance. Elias thought about the dam. The next morning, Elias rose before the sun and drove up the old road to Pine Hollow Dam. The tires of his truck crunched over loose gravel, the sound echoing in the stillness. A thin fog clung to the trees, and the air smelled of wet pine. When he reached the top, he shut off the engine and let the quiet settle in. The only sound was the low, steady rush of water behind the wall of stone. The reservoir spread wide and silver in the early light, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of wind. Inside the control shack, he ran his hands along the iron wheel. The metal was cold and slightly damp. He turned it just enough to feel the resistance of the gears, then stopped. The mechanism was old, but sturdy, the kind of build that didn't give way easily. His father had always said it was made to last longer than the people who used it. On the far wall, the gauges told their story. The water level had crept higher since his last visit. The steady rains of spring had filled the tributaries, and each storm seemed heavier than the last. The reservoir was nearing its limit, though not yet overflowing. Still, the pressure was there, a constant, invisible force pushing against the gates. Elias opened a small metal cabinet and pulled out a can of oil. He worked the nozzle carefully along the hinges of the wheel and the levers beside it. The scent of machine oil filled the shack, sharp and familiar. He wiped the residue with an old cloth, then checked each bolt along the base of the gates. None were loose. None had rusted through. He stood for a moment with his hand on the wheel, listening. Beyond the hum of the water, he could hear the faint creak of the dam adjusting to the weight it held back. It was the sound of power contained, a reminder of what could happen if that power was released. In the afternoons, he returned to the valley and watched the new houses grow more complete. Roof tiles shimmered in the sunlight, and driveways were poured in smooth, clean stretches of concrete. The speed of it was unsettling, like watching a time-lapse play out in real life. Each evening he drove back up the hill. Sometimes he stayed, for only an hour, walking the length of the dam to check for cracks or signs of wear. Other times, he lingered until nightfall, the lights from the valley glowing faintly below. He told himself he was simply maintaining what was his, but the visits began to feel different, more deliberate. He started keeping a notebook on the desk in the shack. Each entry listed the water level, the rainfall since the last visit, and the condition of the machinery. At first, it was habit, something his father had taught him to do. But slowly the notes began to take on a different tone. He added sketches of the valley from memory, marking the low points, the natural channels where water would flow first. By the end of the week, the notebook held more maps than maintenance records. One evening, just after another long rain, Elias stood at the railing and watched the overflow spillway trickle with excess water. The sound was soft now, but he imagined it louder, faster, a roar instead of a murmur. He imagined the water spreading down into the valley, finding the easiest path, and the rows of houses standing directly in its way. The thought lingered, steady and unshakable. As he locked the shack and started the truck, the valley below glimmered in the fading light. The houses looked small from this distance, their new paint bright and clean. The barn stood beyond them, unchanged, its red boards catching the last orange glow of the sun. The letter about repainting sat back at the house, still in the drawer. 30 days. The words circled in his mind as he drove down the hill. The dam, fading behind him in the rearview mirror. The rain began early that day, a slow, steady drizzle that deepened into a downpour by afternoon. Elias sat by the window, watching water bead and streak down the glass. Beyond the barn, the new houses looked muted, their pale siding darkened by the wet. The steady hammering that had filled the valley for weeks was absent. The crews had gone home, leaving the place quiet except for the rain. He had planned to spend the day mending a fence along the western edge of the pasture, but instead he found himself thinking about the dam. Not in a distant, passing way, but with a focus that refused to loosen. Each image came clear, the wheel in the shack, the gauges straining, the slow creep of the water line. By evening, the rain showed no sign of easing. The ground was already soft underfoot when he stepped outside. His boots left deep impressions in the mud as he crossed to the truck. The letter still sat in the desk drawer, but it might as well have been in his pocket. The words were etched into his mind. The climb to Pine Hollow felt longer in the rain. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm as the road curved and rose through the hills. Low clouds hung close, so thick they swallowed the tops of the trees. When he reached the dam, the reservoir was no longer still. The surface rippled with the impact of the rain, and small waves lapped against the stone wall. The overflow spillway was running harder now, water spilling down in a constant sheet. Inside the shack, the air felt damp and close. He pulled the notebook from the shelf and flipped to his most recent entry. The water level was higher than it had been in years, almost at the upper line of the last gauge. The numbers didn't lie. Elias placed the notebook back on the shelf and stepped to the wheel. He rested both hands on its cold metal spokes. It was easy to imagine the sound, not the gentle spill of overflow, but the full force of the gates opening, the roar, the rush, the earth-shaking vibration under his boots. He could see it in his mind, the water racing down the slope, taking everything in its path. He turned the wheel slightly, just enough to feel the gears engage. The metal resisted at first, then gave a slow, heavy groan. He stopped, letting the wheel settle back into place. The rain hammered the tin roof above him. His father's words came back unbidden. Water can give life or it can take it away. As a boy, Elias had thought it was just a warning about safety. Now it felt heavier, a truth about choice and consequence. He walked the length of the dam, boots splashing in shallow puddles that had gathered along the stone. From the far end, he could see the faint glow of the valley lights. The houses were there, lined in neat rows, unaware of the wall of water sitting above them. The decision wasn't simple. He told himself that more than once. But each time he thought of the barn, the letter, the stakes in the field, and the quiet way his land had been claimed piece by piece, the weight on the scale shifted. By the time he returned to the shack, his clothes were damp and his hands cold. He closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch clicking into place louder than it should have been. He stood there in the dim light for a long moment, listening to the hum of the water behind the gates. Then, with deliberate care, he checked each lever, each bolt, and each gauge. Not yet, he told himself, but soon. The night was moonless, the kind where the valley seemed to vanish beyond the glow of the porch light. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. Elias sat at his kitchen table with the lamp burning low, his coffee cooling beside him. The clock on the wall ticked in slow, deliberate beats. He didn't move until the second hand passed midnight. Then he rose, took his coat from the hook, and stepped into the darkness. The gravel crunched under his boots as he crossed to the truck. His breath hung in pale clouds before fading into the night. The road to Pine Hollow was slick from the recent rains. The tires hissed over wet pavement as he climbed. The higher he went, the colder the air became, and a faint mist began to drift across the road. By the time he reached the top, the fog was thick enough to soften the shapes of the dam's walls. He parked in his usual spot and cut the engine. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low rumble of water pressing against the gates. The reservoir was full, its dark surface smooth and unbroken in the faint light from the shack's single window. Inside, the air was damp and cool. Elias set his flashlight on the workbench, its beam sweeping across the iron wheel and the row of levers. The gauges confirmed what he already knew. The water level had reached the upper limit. Any more rain, and the overflow alone wouldn't be enough to hold it back. He placed both hands on the wheel. The metal was cold, almost biting. He drew in a slow breath, then began to turn. At first, the wheel resisted, the gears locked tight, from years of holding steady. But then came the low groan of metal shifting, followed by the deep, resonant clank of the gates unlocking. The first surge of water roared through the opening, echoing through the hollow below. Elias turned the wheel farther, the sound building until it filled the shack like a living thing. The vibration ran up through the floorboards, through his boots, into his bones. Outside, the water spilled into the valley's natural channels, gathering speed as it went. What began as a rush became a torrent, tumbling over rocks and through gullies, churning white in the darkness. It followed the slope without hesitation, drawn toward the low ground where the new houses stood. From the top of the dam, Elias could see nothing at first, only the faint shapes of the hills and the distant glow of the streetlights. But then, one by one, those lights began to wink out as the water reached them, splashing against poles and swallowing the bulbs. The sound from below reached him in waves, a dull, muffled roar of water-meeting structures, the snap of boards. Breaking, the clatter of debris carried downstream. The houses were built strong, but they were no match for the force now pushing against them. He kept his hands on the wheel until it could turn no farther. The gates were wide open, the reservoir, spilling its weight into the valley. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and stone, a scent he had known his whole life, but never like this. When it was done, Elias stepped back and let the wheel rest. The roar outside continued, but it had settled into a steady, relentless rhythm. The dam had done its work. He closed the shack door behind him and walked to the railing. The valley below was a patchwork of shadows and moving water. In the distance, a pale light flickered and went out. The mist hung low, catching the faintest glimmer from the wet ground. Elias stood there for a long time, the cold biting at his hands. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply watched as the water took the path it had always been meant to take. The first light of day came softly, without fanfare. A pale gold edge appeared on the horizon, touching the tops of the hills, and slowly spilling into the valley. Elias stood on his porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching as the mist began to lift. The air carried the heavy scent of wet soil. It was the kind of smell that followed a long rain, but here it was stronger, mingled with the faint tang of raw timber and fresh clay turned over by the water. The quiet was almost complete. No engines, no voices, no hammering. Only the occasional drip of water from the eaves broke the stillness. From where he stood, he could see the field that had once been his pasture. The new houses were no longer lined in neat rows. Some leaned at odd angles, their foundations exposed. Others had been carried partly off their plots, resting in shallow pools like stranded boats. Fences lay scattered, broken into sections. The lawns, once bright and carefully rolled out, were patchwork swaths of mud and standing water. He could trace the water's path easily. It had followed the slope, moved between the ridges, and spread into the low ground before retreating in the early hours. In its wake, it had left a thin sheen of silt across everything it touched. Elias stepped down from the porch and walked toward the barn. The red boards gleamed with a darker richness from the damp, but they stood firm, just as they had for decades. He slid the door open and looked inside. The tools were dry, the bales stacked neatly, untouched by the water's reach. Beyond the barn, the land sloped gently down toward what had been the center of the new development. He walked that way slowly, boots sinking into the soft ground. Pieces of siding lay here and there, twisted in shapes the builders would not have recognized. A child's plastic chair sat tipped on its side, half buried in the mud. At the far edge of the field, a narrow stream still ran, carrying the last of the water away. It made a quiet sound, nothing like the roar of the night before. Birds were starting to return, their calls tentative but growing as the sun climbed higher. In the distance, Elias heard the faint whine of an approaching engine. He turned and saw a county truck making its way down the road. It stopped briefly near what had been a paved entrance to the neighborhood, the driver stepping out to take in the scene. The man's shoulders sagged slightly before he climbed back inside and drove on, leaving deep tire tracks in the soft earth. Elias walked back toward his house, the weight of the night's choice settling into something quieter inside him. He had not celebrated when the gates opened, and he would not now. The valley looked different, altered in a way that would take time to understand. He paused at the porch steps and looked once more toward the hills. From here, Pine Hollow Dam was hidden behind the trees, its stone face invisible from the valley floor. Only he knew the sound of its gates, the feel of the wheel in his hands, the pressure of the water waiting behind it. The coffee in his mug had cooled, but he drank the last of it anyway. The warmth was gone, but the taste was steady, familiar. He set the mug down on the railing and let the morning air move over him. Somewhere in the valley, cleanup would begin. People would measure the damage, make their reports, and try to explain what had happened. The papers might call it a flood brought on by heavy rains. They might call it an act of nature. Elias would not correct them. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist. The land lay open and quiet again, as it had been before. And for the first time in many weeks, Elias felt that it was his once more.